Okay, so good day everyone. I am Princess Claire Artesano and today I am going to discuss the Module 2 and the institutional corrections. But before I am going to tackle everything, I am going to enumerate the coverage of my PowerPoint presentation. So what we will discuss, or what I am going to discuss right now, is the Sing Sing prison, the notable inmates in the Sing Sing prison, the Pennsylvania system, the Auburn system, the infamous prisoners in Pennsylvania system, and the major figures in the Age of Enlightenment. Okay, so in the ancient times, many ancient cultures allowed the victim or a member of the victim's family to deliver justice. So the offender often fled to his or her family for protection, and as a result, blood feud developed in which the victim's family sought revenge against the offender's family. Sometimes, the offender's family responded by striking back, and retaliation could continue until the families tired of killing or stealing from each other, or until one or both families were destroyed or financially ruined. Okay, so in the ancient times, blood feud is happening. It is because when one side of the family member was eliminated, or the other side of the family member hired a killer or a werewolf. A werewolf is an individual which is hired to kill another individual. In a result, blood feuds were happening because of the both families killing each other by hiring another individual to kill the other member of the family of the victim. Okay, so Sing Sing prison. Sing Sing in full Sing Sing Correctional Facility. It is a maximum security prison located in Ossining, New York, and it is in use since 1826. It is one of the oldest penal institutions in the United States, and it is also among the most well-known in the country, especially for its harsh conditions in the 19th and 20th centuries. So, the Sing Sing prison, it was known for its harsh punishment, which is the whippings and floggings, were the commonplace punishments in the Sing Sing prison. And they frequently used the cat o' nine tails, which is the cat o' nine tails was a whipping contraption whose lashes were often tipped with metals or with barbs. And its use was finally abolished in the New York State in the year 1848. Okay, so the history. So Sing Sing prison on the Hudson River at Ossining, New York. Originally known as Mount Pleasant Prison, it was constructed in the village of Sing Sing on the east bank of the Hudson River, some 30 miles north of New York City. Okay, so it was designed to provide additional prison space and to replace Newgate Prison construction, and it was undertaken in 1825 by convict laborers under the supervision of Elam Lins, warden of Auburn State Prison. And he officially became head of the new prison when it opened in 1826, thought it was not completed until 1828. The initial facility had 800 cells, and the prison population rose in the mid-19th century, resulting in more construction, and the 4-story complex was soon 6 stories. So, the Sing Sing Correctional Facility, it currently houses around 1,300 inmates, and it has notoriously been one of the America's most ruthless prisons. The electric chair execution was used in the Sing Sing prison not until it was banned in 1972. And the 4-story complex was soon 6 stories, and the prison eventually housed more than 1,600 inmates because most of the early convicted criminals traveled by boat to Sing Sing. The phrase "up to the river" came to mean going to prison. Actually, Captain Elam Lins, he was a prison warden, and he helped to create the Auburn system, which consisted of congregate labor during the day and isolation during at night. And starting in 1821, and he was warden of Sing Sing prison from 1825 to 1830. Okay, so one of the notable visitors to the prison was Alexis de Tocqueville, the author of Democracy in America. The French government sent sent him and Gustave de Beaumont to the United States in 1831 to gather information about the American penal system. The two men were amazed at the total subjugation under which prisoners worked and the administrative power the warden wielded at Sing Sing. Lins resigned as warden of Sing Sing in 1830 and returned to Auburn in 1838, and he was asked to leave that prison a year later after the death of a prisoner who was punished severely for feigning illness. Despite this record, Sing Sing rehired Lins in 1843. So Alexis de Tocqueville has a great contribution of political despotism because of him. The political despotism becomes clearer when we compare it to Tocqueville's long-ignored writings on the Pennsylvania system, where the system he labeled as the most complete despotism because the prison's dominant characteristics were a rigid isolation of prisoners, strict equality, productive labor, and the complete privatization of life. And Alexis de Tocqueville suggests that by using the terror created by this system, especially by the despair generated by solitary confinement, the prison often succeeded in reshaping the prisoner's mind and reforming the prisoner's instincts. Okay. So whippings and floggings were commonplace punishments at Sing Sing's. Frequently used was the cat o' nine tails, a cruel whipping contraption whose lashes were often tipped with metal or barbs, and its use was finally abolished by the New York State Legislature in 1848. And in addition, while Lins was warden in the Sing Sing prison, inmates were expected to refrain from making noise, which included talking. With the advent of the electric chair in 1891, Sing Sing became notorious for its executions, although the electric chair was developed at neighboring Auburn system. Almost all executions within the state were carried out at Sing Sing prison until 1963, and the infamous death chair was later moved to Greenhaven prison. So whippings and floggings. So when we say whippings and floggings, it is the lashing out or it is the beating of someone or whipping someone with a whip or rod, which blows commonly directed to the person's back. So whipping and flogging is actually very common to us, especially in the movies. So we've seen a lot of scenes in the movies wherein an individual was hurt by his or her back by using latigo. So that is an example of whipping or flogging by the use of latigo. Okay, so cat o' nine tails, it is a rope. It is actually a rope with nine knotted cords, which is formerly used to flog offenders or to whip offenders. And the cat o' nine tails was authorized in the British Navy and Army until 1881. And the electric chair, the infamous electric chair in the Sing Sing prison, well, actually nationally the electric chair is a method of the past, but no other state has used it since 2013. And the electric chair can cause convulsions so severe that they result in the dislocations of the nerves or fractures, and that's why prisoners are strapped down before being executed in the electric chair. Okay, so one of the notable visitors to the prison was Alexis de Tocqueville, the author of Democracy in America. The French government sent him and Gustave de Beaumont to the United States in 1831 to gather information about the American penal system. The two men were amazed at the total subjugation under which prisoners worked and the administrative power the warden wielded at Sing Sing. So Thomas Mott was born in 1859 to 1926. He was an American reformer, and he helped advance the public understanding of prison problems and instituted a number of prison reforms. And Thomas Thomas Mott Osborne's major thesis was that prisoners must be treated as human to be human. Lynch resigned as warden of Sing Sing in 1830 and returned to Auburn in 1838. He was asked to leave that prison a year later after the death of a prisoner who was punished severely for feigning illness. Despite his record, Sing Sing rehired Lynch in 1843. So Sing Sing was also the site of reforms that affected the national penal system. Reformer Thomas Mott Osborne, who developed his penology theories while voluntarily incarcerated for a year at Auburn, served as Sing Sing warden in 1914 and 1916. But his immediate sweeping changes were assailed, and he resigned under his intense political pressure during tenure. However, the first psychological work with inmates began. More reforms were instituted under Lewis Edward Laws, who served as warden from 1920 to 1941. He notably improved the lying conditions within the prison and allowed the inmates to participate in sports. So, Thomas Mott Osborne in 1859 to 1926, he was an American reformer, and he helped advance the public understanding of prison problems, and he instituted a number of prison reforms. So Thomas Mott Osborne's major thesis was that prisoners must be treated as humans because they are humans. Okay, so Lewis Edward Laws, actually he was a prison reformer and he was also a prison warden. So during his 21 years in the Sing Sing Correctional Facility, he supervised the executions of more than 303 prisoners. And actually, he couldn't free Sing Sing. He couldn't free Sing Sing prison as being the nation's leading death chambers. That was out of his hands. So, but Lewis Edward could campaign against the death penalty. And actually, Lewis Edward, he occupies a contradictory place in American penal history. His detractors often accused him of coddling prisoners or protecting prisoners, of being too soft, because actually Lewis Edward is being overprotective when it comes to the prisoners. So he was accused of being too soft with the prisoners when a hardline approach was considered the best way to handle New York State's toughest prisoners. So now we are in the famous prisoners in Sing Sing. Okay, so number one is David Berkowitz. So he was the killer who terrified New York City in 1976 and 1977, and he was imprisoned there for a period of time. So actually Berkowitz, he was found mentally competent to stand trial, and he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, and he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences with possibility of parole after 25 years in state prison. Next one is Ruth Brown Sender. So actually, this murderer was imprisoned at Sing Sing and was executed via the electric chair in 1928. Ruth Brown Sender, on March 27, 1895 to January 12, 1928, he was an American murderess, and her execution in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison in 1928 for the murder of her husband, Albert Sender, and was recorded in a well-publicized photograph. Okay, so actually Ruth Brown Sender is not accountable alone for the death of her husband, but actually she has a partner for killing her husband, which was Gray, her boyfriend. They were both sentenced to death. Jude Gray was her former lover. Jude Gray and Ruth Brown Sender killed her husband, which is Albert. And actually Albert Sender, which was Ruth Brown Sender's husband, he was also known for being emotionally and physically abusive as a husband, because he blames Ruth for the birth of a
daughter rather than a son, and he keeps demanding a perfectly maintained home and physically assaulting both her wife and actually her daughter, which is Lorraine. So on March 20, 1927, Ruth Brownsender and her former lover, Jude Gray, planned to kill her husband, which they garroted Albert, and they stuffed Albert's nose with full of chloroform soaked with drugs, and then staged his death as part of a burglary. So the detectives at the scene noted that the burglar left little evidence of breaking into the house. So moreover, Ruth's behavior was inconsistent with her story of a terrorized wife witnessing her husband being killed. So the next one is Gary Evans. So he was the serial killer, and he was imprisoned in Sing Sing shortly after being arrested for his crimes in 1985. So actually, Gary Evans, he was an American thief, and he confessed serial killer. And he confessed that he was a serial killer in and around the Capital District of New York. And actually, his penchant for stealing antiques and his multiple escapes from custody, including one that ended in his death, and actually it made him headline news in the area on numerous occasions. Eddie Lee May. So actually, Eddie Lee May's execution on August 15, 1963 was a historic one, being the last act of capital punishment in New York State. Mays was executed for a robbery and murder, but was not a well-known criminal. So actually, Eddie Lee May, on March 23, 1961, Eddie Lee May and his companions held a robbery on 5th Avenue on East Harlem. So actually, Eddie Lee May ordered the owner and the patrons to put their cash on the bar. However, a 31-year-old individual who witnesses said that there was an individual who is too slow to comply of Eddie Lee May's direction. So that's why, after opening her purse, Eddie Lee May put a .38 caliber revolver to the forehead of the girl and pulled the trigger and killing her instantly. So the gang stole a total of $275 million from the bartender and several customers during the robbery. So actually, in 1998 interview, there was one lawyer who defended May, or Eddie Lee May, and they are willing to convince the prosecution to make an arrangement lowering the charge of Eddie Lee May from second-degree murder, which would have spared his life. Moreover, Eddie Lee May rejected the offer and saying that he would prefer to be executed. Okay, so the next one is Gerard Arthur Puff. So Gerard Arthur Puff, he was a gangster executed by the federal authorities in New York for killing a federal agent. So born in Dresden, Germany, the 13-year-old Puff, along with his mother and 5-year-old brother, arrived on June 6, 1927 at Ellis Island on board SS Columbus from Bremen. So the family moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he became a naturalized citizen in 1934, but by 1940 he was an inmate in the Wisconsin State Prison in Waupun, Wisconsin, 1952. He traveled from Kansas City to Manhattan with his 17-year-old wife, Annie Laurie, and by this time his career as a bank robber had earned him a spot on the FBI's then most wanted list. So Gerard Arthur Puff, actually he was a dangerous criminal who has been added to the FBI's then most wanted fugitives list, and Gerard Arthur Puff shot and killed an FBI agent on July 26, 1952 in the lobby of a New York hotel. So shortly after he arrived at the Congress Hotel, FBI agents waited to arrest him. He did not remain at room 904 but returned the first floor in a few minutes by the stairway where FBI Special Agent Joseph John Brock, age 44, was stationed. So Gerard Arthur Puff encountered Agent Brock and shot him twice in the chest and took the collapsing officer's gun. Then, with a gun in each hand, pulled zigzag through the hotel's lobby, firing another shot at converging agents. Agents outside the hotel called on Puff to surrender, but he responded with bullets. So Puff was shot and collapsed on the street, and he was taken to a hospital for treatment, then to the prison ward at Bellevue. So Brock was treated by a doctor on the scene, then rushed to a hospital where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. So on May 15, 1953, the District Court for the Southern District of New York, Gerard Arthur Puff was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to death. Puff's attorney appealed the conviction, but to no avail, and he was executed on August 12, 1954 at Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, in the electric chair and declared death at 11:08 p.m. Puff was one of the first people New York State electrician, though, however, was hired to execute. So the execution was the fifth federal execution since President Dwight D. Eisenhower took office on January 20, 1963. So, Willie Sutton. So Willie Sutton became a quasi-celebrity for his bank-robbing antics in the early 20th century. He escaped from prisons many times throughout his life, but his first escape was in 1932 from Sing Sing. So actually, Willie Sutton, he was also called Willie the Actor by name of William Francis Sutton. He was called Willie the Actor because of his talent, for being a good disguiser. So actually, he disguises posing as guard, as messenger, as policeman, as diplomat, or window cleaner to fool authorities. And actually, Willie Sutton is known as a robber and for being a prison escapee. And actually, he was a veteran thief and hoodlum by the time that he was a teenager, and at the age of 21 he was arrested and acquitted on a murder charge. Next one is Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. So the Rosenbergs are famous for being the only spies who were executed during the decades-long Cold War. Both Ethel and Julius were executed via the electric chair at Sing Sing in 1953. So actually, Julius Rosenberg and Ethel Rosenberg, they were American citizens who were convicted of spying on behalf of the Soviet Union. So they were convicted of espionage for providing the Soviet Union with classified information. So when we say espionage, it is spying or intelligence gathering, or it is the act of obtaining information or secret information from non-disclosed sources or divulging of the same without the permission of the holder of the information for a tangible benefit. So the next one is the Cincinnati Declaration. So because many prison administrators were corrupt, convicts were mistreated and used as cheap labor. However, a growing number of prison reformers were beginning to believe that the prison system should be more committed to reform. So in 1870, the newly established National Prison Association, which later became the American Correctional Association, met in Cincinnati, Ohio, and issued a Declaration of Principles. So the philosophy of the Auburn system, which is fixed sentences, silence, isolation, harsh punishment, lockstep work, was considered degrading and destructive to the human spirit. So actually, the Cincinnati, it was called a Declaration of Principles. It was adopted at the 1870 meeting of the National Prison Association, which was held in the Cincinnati. So the declaration stated that prisons should be organized to encourage reformation, rewarding it with release, and it provides common goals along with the national prison, which is to improve their justice system. Next one is the values in the Declaration of Principles included in the following. So, number one is the penal system should be based on reformation, not suffering, and prisoners should be educated to be free, industrious citizens able to function in society, not orderly inmates controlled by the guards. Number two is good conduct should be rewarded, and number three is indeterminate sentencing, not a mandated exact sentence, should include the ability for prisoners to earn their freedoms early through hard work and good behavior. Number four is citizens should understand that society is responsible for the conditions that lead to crime. Number five, prisoners should recognize that they can change their lives. So the Elmira Reformatory. So, the superintendent of the Elmira Reformatory in New York, Zebulon Brockway, in 1827 to 1920, he used some of these ideas when New York opened the reformatory in 1876 for male offenders 16 to 30 years old. So, Brockway believed that rehabilitation could be achieved through education. So, actually, the Elmira Reformatory, or should I say the Elmira system, it was an American penal system named after Elmira Reformatory in New York. And actually in 1876, Zebulon Brockway became an innovator in the Elmira Reformatory or the Elmira Reformatory movement by establishing reformatories for young felons. So actually the Elmira Reformatory gave the reformatory movement two important philosophical tenets, which is the first one is the importance of the specialized care for youthful offenders, and the second one is the recognition that up to a certain age, every criminal ought to be regarded as potentially good citizen.
So, prison reform in the early 20th century. So, by 1900s, Brockway's correctional philosophy has spread throughout the nation. Nonetheless, by World War I, the idea of using educational and rehabilitative approaches was being replaced by the use of strict discipline. The way the facilities were built, the lack of trained personnel, and the attitudes of the guards made Brockway's ideas difficult to implement. In addition, the introduction of a probation system kept the offenders easiest to rehabilitate out of the reformatories. Despite this return to discipline, the reform movement survived. The progressives of the early 20th century believed that if prisons applied the ideas of behavioral science to the inmates, prisoners could be rehabilitated. So the progressives worked to change the social environment from which criminals came and to design ways to rehabilitate individual inmates. So by the 1920s, reformers were strongly advocating indeterminate sentencing, parole, and treatment programs as a way to rehabilitate offenders, but this approach to corrections was not put into practice until decades later. While many of the reforms had merit, most could not be properly implemented due to inadequate funding or the unwillingness of prison officials to act. As each reform that apparently failed to solve the problem of crime, many people become disillusioned. So now we are in the prisons as workplaces. So despite the efforts of reformers, most societies prefer that prisons pay their own way. So to do this, prison administrators have at times constructed factories within prison walls or hired inmates out as laborers in chain gangs. In rural areas, inmates work on prison-owned farms. In the South, prisoners, predominantly African American, were often leased out to local farmers. So prison superintendents justified the hard labor as teaching the offenders the value of work and self-discipline. So prison administrators hired inmates out as laborers or chain gangs. So when we say chain gangs, it is a road gang or a group of prisoners chained together to perform physically or mental challenging work as a form of punishment. And this punishment might include to repair buildings, to build roads, or to clear land. And African and American prisoners were often leased out to local farmers, so meaning they agreed both the prison administrators and the African American prisoners
to be a local farmer. So many free citizens, after all, earn their livings doing such work in factories and fields. Some penologists, those who study prison management, believe that the harshness of the prisons made these inmates more vindictive against society. With the rise of labor unions in the North, the 1930s saw an end to the large-scale prison industry. Unions complained about competing with the inmates, free labor especially, and the rising unemployment of the Great Depression. By 1940, the states had limited what inmates could produce. So by the 1970s, the number of prison farms had decreased substantially because they were expensive to operate and the prisons found it cheaper to purchase food. In addition, agricultural work no longer prepared inmates for employment outside prison. Since the 1970s, however, support for the prison factories as a way to train inmates for outside job has grown. Penologists believe that working in prison factories help keep prisoners from being bored and teaches them skills. While they believe prisoners benefits from work, they also assert that prisoners should not suffer the exploitation that characteristics the factories of the 1920s. So, Auburn State Prison. So, Auburn Prison System is located in Auburn, New York. It opened in 1816 and it established a disciplinary and administrative system which is based on silence, corporal punishment, and congregate. Or, congregate is when congregate group labor. In architectural and routine, Auburn became the model for prisons throughout the United States. In the early 19th century, many Americans believed that industrialization and dramatic demographic, economic, and political upheavals had conspired against the traditional control of family, church, and community. From their perspective, these moral guardians could no longer adequately control disorder. They saw crime as a product of social chaos. Necessary to its eradication was a structured environment in which deviants could be separated from the disorder of society and the contagion of one another. Their solution was to create the penitentiary, a new institution for reforming offenders and ultimately restoring social stability. So Auburn originally used congregate cells, but in 1821, Warden William Britton borrowed the concept of solitary cells from the so-called Pennsylvania system. Britton designed a unique 5-tiered cell blocks of 2 rows of single cells placed back-to-back in the center of the building. Cells measured only 3.5 feet long and 7 meters high. Doors faced outer walls lined with grated windows that provide indirect light and air. The pattern of small inside cell blocks was later adopted by most state prisons in the United States, whereas the Pennsylvania system inmates did handicraft work in their cells. Auburn prisoners labored in congregate workshops, offsetting imprisonment caused by fulfilling private industry contracts. A hidden passageway with small openings surrounded the work area, allowing inspectors and visitors to surreptitiously monitor the inmates. Auburn briefly implemented a 3-level classification system. Under it is the minor offenders, which is labored in workshops during the day and retired to separate cells at night. And the serious offenders alternated their days between solitary confinement and congregate work. The most hardened criminals were placed in a solitary confinement without work. After numerous suicides, instances of mental illness, and attempted escapes, the governor of New York terminated the classification system and the experiment in solitary confinement. Subsequently, all male inmates work in congregate shops by day, returning to individual cells at night. Females first committed to Auburn in 1825 were relegated to an attic and excluded from regular work and exercise. To ensure that inmates did not corrupt one another, Britton's successor, Elma Lins, enforced a quasi-military routine of absolute silence, strict discipline, and economic productivity.
In response to bells, head-shaven inmates, dressed in stripped clothing, silently marched in lockstep formation to and from their cells for meals and work assignments. Letters were burned and the chaplain was the only occasional visitor. Flogging and other forms of corporal punishment enforced the rules such as regimentation was thought necessary to restrain the rebellious nature of the offender. So to ensure that inmates did not correct one another, Britain's successor, which is El Malins, enforced a quasi-military routine, it is a certain military aspects, which include silence and strict discipline and economic productivity. So such regimentation was also thought necessary to restrain. So regimentation was also applied, which it is a strict discipline which is enforced for the rebellious nature of the offenders. So riots and uprisings in Auburn. So Auburn has a long history of controversy, scandal, and riot, and it has been the site of several notable riots over the years, including November 1820 and a race-related riot in 1921. The most serious were two related incidents in the summer and winter of 1929. On July 28, 1929, only a week after a similar incident at Clinton Prison in Dannemora, inmates sprayed acid in an officer's face and gained access to the prison's armory. Prison shops were set on fire, 6 buildings were destroyed, and 4 prisoners escaped. 2 inmates were killed and 1 wounded, and 5 officers were injured. Later that year, on December 11, Warden Edgar Jennings and 6 guards were taken hostage by a group of inmates, which some of whom had obtained guns in the July riot and concealed them in the interim. So this uprising caused the death of Principal Keeper George A. Durnford as well as the 8 prisoners. 3 inmates were later charged, convicted, and executed at Sing Sing for their roles in the riots. On November 4, 1970, inmates succeeded in seizing control of the facility and held 50 people, including guards and outside construction workers, hostage for more than 8 hours. The incident was attributed to increasing racial tensions and to prisoners' rights being violated in the Auburn prison system. So now we are in the notable inmates in Auburn prison. So Abraham Grintle. Abraham Grintle is known as the General. He was an American criminal known as one of the most expert pickpockets in the nation. He was a thief and fence for more than 40 years and led a nationwide ring of pickpockets. Grintle and his gang of associates were pickpockets, sneak thieves, and fencers. So when we say pickpockets or pickpocketing, it is a form of stealing money from another person without them noticing at any time. And they are also a sneak thief, which is a sneak thief. It is a thief who steals whatever is available without using violence or force or breaking into buildings. Next one is Donald Francos. So Donald Francos, aka Tony the Greek, he was a contract killer for the mafia, and at various times he was also a pimp, a drug dealer, a burglar, and loan shark. His story forms the basis of the most significant true crime book in memory, for Francos gives details here of such events as the 1957 shooting of Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner of Murder, Incorporated, and the 1972 robbery of the Hotel Pier in Manhattan, which may have netted as much as $25 million. So Donald Franco, he was also a pimp, which he controls prostitutes and arranges clients for them, and he takes part for their earnings in return. And he was also a burglar, which is they illegally enter a building with intent to commit a crime, especially for robbery. Donald Franco is also a loan shark, which he is a money lender. So they are called sharks because they are like sharks. They are aggressive, they are angry and greedy, so they can do many illegal things to get repayment. So like kidnapping or even killing to get the money back.
So Francos claims to have been on the hit team and to have dismembered the corpse with a chainsaw and a meat cleaver. Hoffa's body parts in plastic bags were purportedly buried in cement at Giants Stadium in East Rutherford. So a man whose only regret is that he became a rat. Francos is at his most vivid in recalling the horror of his prison life. So Francos also claimed that he is one of the hit team, which is hit team. It is a group of trained people who are sent to kill someone. Next one is Robert Garrow. So Robert Francis Garrow Jr. on March 4, 1936 to September 11, 1978. He was an American serial rapist and later spree killer who was active in New York. In the early 1970s, after committing several rapes, Garrow went on an 18-day killing spree and stabbed 4 people to death before being apprehended. So his criminal trial, known as the Buried Body case, became an important case in legal ethics after his attorneys refused to disclose the location of the bodies of 2 of his victims. Citing attorney-client privilege, Garrow was later shot dead while escaping from prison in 1978. So, Robert Garrow was a spree killer. When we say spree killer, it is someone who commits a criminal acts that involves 2 or more murders or homicides in a day, in a short time of span, and in multiple locations. So, the next one is William Francis Kemmler. So, William Francis Kemmler, May 9, 1860 to August 6, 1890, he was an American peddler, alcoholic, and murderer who in 1890 became the first person in the world to be executed by electric chair. He was convicted of murdering Matilda Thiel Ziegler, his common-law wife. A year earlier, although electrocution had previously been successful use to kill a hearse, Kemmler's execution did not go smoothly. So William Francis Kemmler, he was an American peddler. When we say peddler, it is a person or an individual who goes from place to place selling illegal drugs or stolen goods in many other places. So Pennsylvania system. So Pennsylvania system, it is a penal method based on the principle that solitary confinement fosters penitence and encourages reformation. So the idea was advocated by the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, whose most active members were Quakers. When we say Quakers, it is a member of individuals or groups which is a member of religious society or Christian movement. So in 1829, the Eastern State Penitentiary on Cherry Hill in Philadelphia applied the so-called separate philosophy. So prisoners were kept in solitary confinement in cells 16 feet high, nearly 12 feet long, and 7.5 feet wide. An exercise yard completely enclosed to prevent contact among prisoners was attached to each cell. Prisoners saw no one except institution officers and an occasional visitor. Solitary penitence, however, was soon modified to include the performance of work such as shoemaking or weaving. So the Pennsylvania system spread until it predominated in European prisons. Critics in the United States argued that it was too costly and had deleterious effects on the minds of the prisoners. The Pennsylvania system was superseded in the United States by the Auburn system. So, when we say superseded, it was replaced by the Auburn system. So, the Pennsylvania system was replaced by the United States, which is the Auburn system. So, now, that is the picture of Pennsylvania system. So, now we are in the most infamous criminals in Pennsylvania system. Starting from the Blue-Eyed Six, which is after taking out life insurance policies amounting to $8,000 for Joseph Robber, an impoverished elder neighbor in Lebanon County. In the summer of 1878, a group of 6 men arranged Robber's murder. So the group became known as the Blue-Eyed Six after the local media noted that these 6 men had blue eyes. So Blue-Eyed Six, it is the haunted history of one of Pennsylvania's strangest murders, because on July 8, 1878, one of the strangest murder happens.
which is it is a plot in Pennsylvania's history began with the purchase of an insurance in Lebanon country. So this group of guys, which is these 6 men, they bought an insurance which called assessment insurance or graveyard insurance. So graveyard insurance, it is a burial insurance which is used to pay funeral services and other merchandise costs after a death. So they offer a graveyard insurance to the poor old man, which is Joseph Raver, so that after his death, they will receive an amount of insurance which is for the funeral services and the merchandises cost if the old man will be dead. So this story, this gained national attention, perhaps because of the similarities between the 6 conspirators, because the media found that these 6 conspirators were all illiterate and they were all living in poverty, and they all had 6 blue eyes. Okay, so the next one is Gary Heidnik. So he was dubbed as the House of Horrors. Killer Gary Heidnik murdered 2 women in his North Philadelphia home, where he held 6 victims in chains, raping them and using electrical shock on them during 1986 and 1987. So those who survived said he kept them half naked in his basement, feeding them dog food laced with human remains. He was arrested after one of the captives escaped and alerted police. So in 1999, he became the last person to be executed in Pennsylvania. So Gary Heidnik, he is one of the most brutal and sadistic serial killers. So actually, there was a movie that was made in the year 2012, which is The Factory. It was inspired by Gary Heidnik, and on January 16, 2021, there was a channel that aired a 2-hour special movie titled Monster Preacher, in which the 2 of Heidnik's victims recounted his crimes. And Gary Heidnik was sentenced to death, and he was executed by lethal injection in July 1999. So now we are in Grady Stiles Jr. So Grady Franklin Stiles Jr., he was an American freak show performer and murderer. His deformity was the genetic condition ectrodactyly, in which the fingers and toes are fused together to form claw-like extremities. Because of this, Stiles performed under the stage named Lobster Boy. So his deformities made him unable to walk, but from all accounts, he had tremendous upper body strength that he used to beat and torture his wife and children. He once delivered a beating that caused his pregnant daughter to miscarry. In Pittsburgh in 1978, he shot and killed his oldest daughter's boyfriend, and he was convicted of the murder but sentenced to just 15 years probation because of his health concerns. And so with the beatings escalating, Mary Stiles, his wife, paid a neighbor $1,500 to shoot and kill her husband, and in 1994 a jury convicted her of conspiracy to commit murder, and she was sentenced to 12 years in prison. So to make the long story short, Grady Stiles, he was known for being alarmingly strong and abusive towards his wife and his children, and the worst was yet to come when Grady Stiles' daughter, which was Donna, fell in love with a boy or a young man, but that young man he didn't approve of. So Stiles went to see his daughter's fiancé the day before their wedding, and he intended to kill the young man before giving his blessing for the wedding plan for the next day. So however, it began on the
before the wedding when Styles picked up his shotgun and murdered the fiancé of his daughter in cold blood. So the next one is Mark Spotts. So Mark Spotts, he was a convicted murderer. Mark Spotts is escorted out the Cumberland County Courthouse in Carlisle on May 9, 1996. Mark Spotts killed 4 people in a 4-day murder that began with an argument with his brother over a gerbil. He killed his brother Dustin in Clearfield County on January 31, 1995. Accompanied by his 17-year-old girlfriend, he then shot and killed June Olinger, 52, of Schuylkill County, and stole her car. Spot and his girlfriend then carjacked Penny Gunnett of New York County at gunpoint and stole her cash credits and jewelry. So police later found Gunnett's body beneath her abandoned car. Spotts and his girlfriend separated. She would surrender to police, and Spotts abducted his final victim, Betty Armstutz, 17, near her Harrisburg home and killed her in North Middletown Township before surrendering to police. Armstutz, a retired Lutheran deaconess, was shot 9 times. Spot today is on death row. So Mark Spott, on September 26, 1995, actually a jury convicted Spott of voluntary manslaughter, which it is a third-degree murder and an aggravated assault. Applying intentional, when we say third-degree murder, it was an assault that it applies intentional force in another person and recklessly endangering another person. So he was also convicted for carrying a firearm without a license and driving the provision forbidding a former convict from owning a firearm. And the next one is Sundance Kid. His crimes took place in the Wild West, but Harry Alonzo Longbro, who would be known as the Sundance Kid, was born in Montclair, PA. He headed west, however, when he was 15 and got his nickname from his first crime, stealing a horse in Sundance, Wyoming. He spent a few years in jail, and according to some biographers, he tried to go straight, but within a few years of his release, was robbing trains and banks with his gang, the Wild Bunch. He eventually fled to South America, and there's disagreement over whether he died there in a shootout or later returned to the US. His exploits were romanticized in the classic movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So, in Sundance Kid case, at age of 15, he headed west, and he received his nickname when he was arrested for stealing a horse in Sundance, Wyoming. And after a couple of years there in jail, Sundance Kid resumed his career in crime, robbing trains and banks. Charles Roberts IV. So, Charles Roberts IV, in the morning of October 2, 2006, 32-year-old milk truck driver Charles Carl Roberts IV drove about a mile from his home to a one-room Amish schoolhouse in Nickel Mines, Lancaster County. So he offered the boys from the school, then barricaded himself inside with 10 girls ages 6 to 13. He tied them up and opened fire, killing 5 girls and injuring 5 before committing suicide. So in Charles Roberts' case, at the age of 32, he killed 5 girls and he injured 5 others, and then he killed himself. Robert was armed with a semi-automatic handgun, a shotgun, a rifle, 2 knives, a stun gun, and 600 rounds of ammunition. And police had speculated that time that the shooting was to avenge something that happened to him when he was 12 years old. And the police said Roberts had planned the attack. So Harvey Miguel Robinson, he is one of the youngest serial killers in history, being just 18 when he was arrested and charged with the rape and murders of 3 people in Allentown, which is Johan Burkhardt, a 29-year-old nurse's aide, Charlotte Scomure, a 15-year-old newspaper carrier, and Jessica Jane Fortney, a 47-year-old grandmother. He also raped and brutalized a woman who escaped. He returned to her home several nights later and tried to break in, which led to his arrest. He also raped a 5-year-old, choked her, and left her dead. Okay, so Harvey Miguel Robinson is an American serial killer who committed his murders in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1992 and 1993, and his crimes were extremely brutal. But what sets Robinson apart from many other serial killers is that of his age. He was only 17 when he began committing crimes, been murdering, and he was 18 when he was finally caught. And Robinson was sentenced to a combined 97 years in prison and 3 death sentences. However, his lawyers were able to get the two out of the 3 death sentences, but then there is still a 1 death sentence that remains. So the next one is Hugo Zelensky. So authorities have wanted to nab Hugo Zelensky on murder charges ever since they searched his northeastern Pennsylvania yard in 2003 and found the bodies of a missing pharmacist, the pharmacist's girlfriend, and at least 3 other sets of human remains. It took nearly a dozen years and 1 failed prosecution to finally get their man on Wednesday after a jury convicted the 41-year-old career criminal in the strangling deaths of pharmacist Michael Kirkowski and Tammy Fassett. So Hugo Zelensky, he was 41 when he was convicted last week on the 2 counts of first-degree murder in the killings of Michael Kirkowski and Tammy Fassett during a robbery at the pharmacist's home, and he showed no reaction to the jury's decision, which means he will serve life without parole. The next one is Elmo Nowak. In Elmo Nowak's case, it became known as the Babes in the Woods murders. Elmo Nowak and his niece Winifred Pierce left California with Nowak's daughters and headed to Pennsylvania in 1934, arriving there with no money and no job. Investigator believes Nowak killed his daughters Norma Sedgwick, 12, DeWillia Nowak, 10, and Cordelia Nowak, which is 8 years old, on November 21 rather than left them starved. Their bodies were found on November 24, 1934 in Cumberland County near what is today the entrance to Pine Grove Fumile State Park. On the same day they were found, Nowak shot and killed Pierce and then killed himself in Blair County. The Babes in the Wood murders were the murders of 2 9-year-old girls, Nicola Fellows and Karen Hathaway. So now we are in the incapacitation. So incapacitation, it seeks to prevent future crime by physically moving criminals away from society. This punishment can be traced to ancient times. Terence Mead and Hong Lu write in Punishment, a comparative historical perspective, banishment was a common penalty in antiquity, and later it was common for colonizing European countries to ship convicts and undesirable overseas. So in modern times, house arrest, incarceration, and the death penalty are all forms of incapacitation. So incapacitation, in the context of criminal sentencing philosophy, it is one of the functions of punishment, and it involves capital punishment, which sends an offender to prison or possibly restricting them for their freedom in the community and to protect society and prevent that person from committing further crimes. So the next form of punishment is deterrence. So the goal of deterrence is to persuade citizens and possible offenders or re-offenders to conform to the rules of law. Mead and Lu explain that the 4 types of deterrence are generally recognized. So specific deterrence analyzes how effective punishment is on an individual's future behavior. General deterrence seeks to understand how individual punishment can deter others from committing crimes. Marginal deterrence, it seeks to reconcile how effective different types of punishment are as either specific or general deterrence. The 4th one is the partial deterrence. It refers to situation in which
in which the threat of penalty has some deterrent value even when someone engages in illegal behavior. For example, a criminal simply robbing a victim instead of causing physical harm. So actually, in deterrence, it is a type of punishment it is a theory of choice in which ang individuals balance the benefits and the costs of crime, or the pros and costs of crime. So many believe that if offenders see that crimes are punishable or punished severely, then it should put them off from committing that kind of crime. And it should also show others in society that crimes are punished, and it should also deter them from committing that similar type of crime. So the next type of punishment is retribution. So retribution is one of the oldest form of punishment. Retribution has roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition of justice. So in her book Criminal Law, Lisa M. Storm explains that retribution prevents crime by giving victims or society a certain sense of satisfaction that a defendant has been punished appropriately, reinforcing the belief that the criminal justice system is working effectively. So modern examples of retribution include the widespread practices of imposing fines, as well as enforcing mandatory sentencing policies for certain offenses under the law. And as an effective punishment, retribution has been criticized as being overly rigid and limited in its capacity to charge societal behavior. However, it remains popular. So, retribution or retributive justice, it is a theory of punishment that when an offender breaks the law, justice requires that they suffer in return, and that the response to a crime is proportional to the offense. So, the old punishment code of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is an example of retributive justice theory. So, the next type of punishment is rehabilitation. So, it is a common prison policy in America up until the 1970s. Rehabilitation, which focuses on helping criminals and prisoners overcome the barriers that led them to committing criminal acts. So, this includes developing occupational skills as well as resolving psychological issues such as drug addiction and aggression. And it explains the American Psychological Association, or APA, and it is considered as the opposite of retribution. The ultimate purpose of rehabilitation is to transition offenders back into society. So the APA reports that in examining massive data, individualized approaches to crime complemented with community-based approaches can prove effective in reducing offender recidivism. So in rehabilitation type of punishment, it can reduce the impact of a broad range of health conditions, including diseases which is acute or chronic diseases, illness or injuries, and it can also complement other health interventions such as medical or surgical interventions, and it helps to achieve the best outcome possible. So the most recently formulated theory of punishment is that of the rehabilitation, the idea that the purpose of punishment is to apply treatment and training to the offender so that he is made capable of returning to society and functioning as a law-abiding member of the community. So now we are in the age of enlightenment. So Cesar Buonasana de Beccaria, Marquis of Gualdrasco and Villagregio. So Cesar Beccaria, in full Cesar Buonasana, Marquis de Beccaria, which was born on March 15, 1738 in Milan, Italy. He died on November 28, 1794. Horror, Crimes and Punishment on 1880. It was a celebrated volume on the reform of criminal justice. Beccaria was the son of a Milanese aristocrat of modest means. So from an early age, he displayed the essential traits of his character. A highly volatile temperament resulted in periods of enthusiasm followed by depression and inactivity. So he was reserved and somewhat take-home in his social contacts but placed great value on his personal and family relationships. And at the age of 8, he was sent to the Jesus School in Parma. Beccaria later described that the education he received as a fanatical and stifling to the development of human feelings. Although he revealed a mathematical aptitude, little in his student days gave indication of the remarkable intellectual achievements that were soon to follow. In 1758, he received a degree in law from the University of Pavia, And in 1760, Beccaria proposed marriage to the 16-year-old Teresa Blasco, encountered the obdurate opposition of his father. So the following year, the marriage took place without parental consent, and the young couple began their life together in poverty, and the breach between father and son was ultimately repaired. And Beccaria and his wife were received into the family home. In 1762, a daughter, the first of his 3 children, was born. So, Beccaria himself dated his discovery of the Enlightenment to 1761, when he began to read the works of the French and Scottish philosophers and discussed them with a circle of young friends led by Pietro Verri in all the provinces of the Austrian Empire, including Milan. Absolutist reforms emanating from Vienna continued to encounter entrenched resistance from noble and ecclesiastical corporations from the juridical culture of the ancient regime. So, Cesare Beccaria. So, Beccaria's treatise marked the high point of the Milan Enlightenment in it because Beccaria put forth some of the first modern arguments against the death penalty. His treatise was also the first full work of penology, advocating reform of the criminal law system. And Cesare Beccaria opposes capital punishment except under very restricted circumstances, and Cesare Beccaria argues that torture should never be used against an accused whose guilt has not officially been established, and his ideas about rights and punishments influenced reform movements throughout Europe. And in the United States, many laws concerning crime and punishment reflect Cesare Beccaria's ideas. And Cesare Lombroso, described as the father of modern criminology, Cesare Lombroso's theory of the born criminal dominated thinking about criminal behavior in the late 19th and early 20th century. So on November 6, 1835 to October 19, 1909, Cesare Lombroso was the founder of the Italian school of positivist criminology. He rejected the established classical school, which held that crime was a characteristic trait of human nature and that rational choices were the foundation of behavior. Lombroso, using a scientific approach and concepts drawn from physiognomy, early eugenics, psychiatry, and social Darwinism, he argued that criminality was inherited and that the born criminal could be identified by physical defects, which confirmed a criminal is savage or atavistic, while his particular identifying characteristics are no longer considered valid. The idea of factors that predispose certain individuals to commit crimes continues to be foundational to work in criminology. Together with his emphasis on the scientific method, this revolutionary approach has earned Lombroso the title as the father of scientific criminology. So in Cesare Lombroso's case in the Age of Enlightenment, he was famous among the criminologists, and his positivist criminology theory explained that some criminals were born that way and their criminal activities are a result of nature, while others became criminals due to their experiences in life. And the main principle of Cesare Lombroso's best-known works is the conception of an intimate relation between the mental and physical characteristics and that the possession of certain traits. So the next one is William I by name, William the Conqueror, or William the Bastard, or William of Normandy, French Guillaume Le Conquérant, or Guillaume le Batad, or Guillaume de Normandy. So before he became the King of England, William I was one of the mightiest nobles in France as the Duke of Normandy, but he is best remembered for leading the Norman conquest of England in 1066, which changed the course of English history and earned him the sobriquet William the Conqueror. This one is Enrico Ferri. So Ferri was born in Lombardy in 1856, and he worked first as a lecturer and later as a professor of criminal law, having spent time as a student of Cesare Lombroso. So while Lombroso researched anthropological criminology, Ferri focused more on social and economic influences on the criminal and crime rates. So Ferry's research led to him postulating theories calling for crime prevention methods to be the mainstay of law enforcement, as opposed to punishment of criminals after their crimes had taken place. He became a founder of the Positivist school, and he researched psychological and social positivism as opposed to the biological positivism of Lombroso. So Enrico Ferri, at that time a radical, was elected to Italian parliament in 1886. In 1893, he joined the Italian Socialist Party and edited their daily newspaper, The Avanti. Okay, so in 1893, he joined the Italian Socialist Party and he edited their daily newspaper, The Avanti. In 1900s and 1904, he spoke out in Congress against the roles of socialist ministers in bourgeois governments. So Ferri favored Italian neutrality during World War I, and he was re-elected as a Socialist Party deputy in 1921. In post-war Italy, he became a supporter of Mussolini's fascist regime. Ferri died in 1929. So Enrico Ferri, he was a student of Cesare Lombroso, the so-called father of criminology, who advocated for biological determinism in the context of criminology. However, Enrico Ferri developed the theory of Cesare Lombroso and belonged to the criminal sociology school. He believed that the reason of crime is not completely determined by the individual's biological genes, but Enrico Ferri believed that the result of the combination of physiological genes and natural conditions and social environment affects the criminality of an individual. And Enrico Ferri instead focused on the role of social and environmental factors in crime. Next one is Clifford Shaw. So Clifford drove Shaw in 1895 to 1957. He was an American sociologist and criminologist, and he was a major figure in the Chicago School of Sociology during the 1930s and 1940s, and he is considered to be one of the most influential figures in American criminology. His work on juvenile delinquency with Henry D. McKay, conducted in the late 1920s, played a pivotal role in moving the study of such delinquency towards the discipline of sociology. And away from psychology and psychiatry, Shaw and McKay's work spanned three general areas, which is studying geographic variation in rates of juvenile delinquency, the study of autobiographical works by delinquents, and the developments of the Chicago Area Project, a delinquency prevention program in the Chicago area. The two studies published by Shaw and McKay in the 1930s and 40s were still held in high regard among social scientists in the 1970s. So Clifford Shaw, the social disorganization theory developed by Shaw and McKay is based on their studies in Chicago, and they had pointed to social causes of delinquency or the minor crime, especially that committed by young people, that seem to be located in specific geographical areas, and they proved the link between social disorganization and the delinquency. And for example, if a neighborhood becomes disorganized, its residents also cannot exercise social control. And the next one is Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant, he was a German philosopher, and he is one of the foremost thinkers in the Age of Enlightenment. So his comprehensive and systematic work in epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, and ethics and aesthetics, greatly influenced all subsequent philosophy, especially the various schools of Kantianism and ideas. So the next one is Baruch Spinoza. So he is one of the foremost exponents of 17th century rationalism and one of the early and seminal thinkers of the Enlightenment and modern biblical criticism, including modern conceptions of the self and the universe. He came to be considered as one of the most important philosophers and certainly the most radical of the early modern period. So he became inspired by the groundbreaking ideas of René Descartes. Spinoza became a leading philosophical figure of the Dutch Golden Age. Spinoza's given name, which means blessed, varies among different languages. Spinoza also has an IQ of 175. So Spinoza, his teachings on the divine, on the psychological basis of prophecy, and of the limits of religious authority, of clearly challenged the claims of orthodoxy. Spinoza defended the philosophic life against religious persecution and argued for a new liberal democratic regime supportive of that life. So now we are on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he was the least academic of modern philosophers, and in many ways he was the most influential. So his thought marked the end of the European Enlightenment, which is the age of reason, and he propelled political and ethical thinking into new channels. So his reforms revolutionized taste, first in music and then in other arts. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau taught parents to take a new interest in their children and to educate them differently. He furthered the expression of emotion rather than polite restraint in friendship and love. He introduced the cult of religious sentiment among people who had discarded religious dogma. He opened people's eyes to the beauties of nature, and he made liberty an object of almost universal aspiration. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the least academic of modern philosophers, and in many ways he was the most influential. His thought marked the end of the European Enlightenment, which was the age of reason. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau described three stages in which he investigated. The first one is the state of nature, where man is free and independent, and the second one is the society in which the man is oppressed and dependent on others, and the third one is the state under the social contract in which ironically a man becomes free through obligation. So the next one is Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. So Leibniz's deep religious faith and affinity for tradition kept him conservative in his approach to his work, permitted his writings, and paved the way for the mysticism of the rest of the German Enlightenment. Leibniz laid a foundation that all future Enlightenment scholars would build upon. First major figure in German Enlightenment was the brilliant Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, which in 1646 to 1716. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz began his career in law, but he quickly moved out into other fields. So Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, actually he was equal to Newton because they both discovered calculus at the same time. The next one is Denis Diderot. So Diderot was an original scientific theorist of the Enlightenment who connected the newest scientific trends to radical philosophical ideas such as materialism. He was especially interested in the life of sciences and their impact on our traditional ideas of what a person or humanity itself are. So Denis Diderot, he is a French philosopher, and he was also an essayist, and he served as a chief of editor in 1745 to 72 in the Encyclopedia, and he plays a role of interpreters or originators in the Age of Enlightenment. So David Hume in 1711 to 1776, he was a prominent intellectual of the Enlightenment. So his books and essays generated radically innovative theories of human understanding, knowledge, religious beliefs, moral practice, aesthetic judgment. David Hume, he was an empiricist, so meaning he believed causes and effects are discoverable not by reason but by experience. And he goes on to say that even with the perspective of the past, humanity cannot dictate future events because thoughts of the past are limited compared to the possibilities for the future. The next one is Voltaire. Voltaire's failure to produce an original philosophy was in a sense counterbalanced by his deliberate cultivation of a philosophy of action. His common sense crusade against superstition and prejudice and in favor of religious toleration was his single greatest contribution to the progress of enlightenment. So Voltaire, he was a French Enlightenment writer, historian, and also a philosopher. Voltaire was famous for his wit and his attacks on the established Catholic Church and his advocacy of freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and separation of church from the state. And Voltaire influenced the Bill of Rights. By the way, his belief in freedom of speech and freedom of religion is portrayed in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. So now we are in community corrections. So in response to an increase in crime during the 1960s, advocates of community corrections thought that rehabilitation needed to be done within the community, not in the prisons. So they favored probation, educational courses, and job training. In 1965, The Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice, a panel of experts in crime and the justice system, recommended improvements to the correctional system and initiated the first standards for operating prison facilities. So the task force recommended alternative community-based approaches, educational and vocational programs, and different treatments for special offender categories. So as a result, the American Correctional Association Commission of Accreditation established standards by which it assesses correctional facilities for voluntary accreditation.